The room sits in near darkness, tucked behind an anonymous door on Bahnhofstrasse in Zurich. The year is 1944, late autumn. On a mahogany table, a map of Europe spreads beneath a single lamp, its surface crowded with pins, red at Stalingrad, black at Kursk, blue at Normandy, white at the Ardennes. The man who stands over it wears no uniform. He is perhaps 50, his face lined but unremarkable, the kind of face you would pass on any Swiss street without a second glance. On his desk lie documents that should never exist in the same room. A British situation report stamped most secret, a German operational summary marked Geheime Kommandosache, a Soviet courier's scribbled intelligence update, and a decoded Japanese naval dispatch. He does not command divisions. His name appears in no order of battle. Yet in the coming months, historians will puzzle over curious patterns in the greatest war humanity has ever known. Moments when offensives stalled just short of breakthrough, when intelligence arrived at precisely the right hour to prevent catastrophe, when the razor's edge between total victory and absolute collapse seemed guided by an invisible hand. If you could ask the generals whose names will fill the history books, Eisenhower, Patton, Montgomery, Zhukov, Manstein, Guderian, Rommel, Yamamoto, they might tell you they sometimes sensed another presence in the war, a shadow intelligence that seemed to know too much and reveal too little, always at the moment when the abyss yawned widest. This is not the story those generals told. This is the story of what might have lived in the silence between the official histories. He was born in Basel in 1894, the son of a minor banking family. During the Great War, he served as a signals officer on the Western Front, attached to a Swiss observation unit permitted by both sides to monitor compliance with conventions on prisoner treatment. What he witnessed in those trenches, the industrial slaughter, the casual incineration of entire generations, the creeping use of gas, and the whispered experiments with worse, left him with a conviction that shaped everything that followed. That modern war, left to its own momentum, does not end in victory, but in extinction. After 1918, he drifted into the grey world between banking and information. Switzerland's neutrality made it the clearinghouse for secrets. Every intelligence service maintained contacts in Zurich and Geneva. Every refugee carried documents. Every diplomatic pouch passed through Swiss hands. By the mid-1920s, he had become what the French called an information broker, a man who knew people, who could verify a rumor, who could arrange a quiet meeting in a hotel lobby where two men who officially did not speak could exchange what they needed to know. In 1933, he watched Hitler take power. In 1936, he watched the Spanish rehearsal. In 1938, Munich. By then, he had cultivated a network across Europe, staff officers he had met during the war, younger men he had helped with discreet loans or information, intelligence professionals who owed him favors. He saw what was coming, not just another war, but a war fought with tanks and aircraft and codes, a war that could escalate into chemical apocalypse or something worse. Technologies whispered about in physics journals that spoke of chain reactions and uncontrollable energy. Sometime in 1939, between the fall of Poland and the winter quiet, he made a decision that transformed him from observer to participant. He would build a network, not to spy for one side or another, but to create a hidden circuit linking staff officers on every front, men who would feed him intelligence and receive from him carefully curated information designed for one purpose: to prevent the war from crossing the threshold into total annihilation. He did not seek victory for any nation, he sought survival for civilization itself. The logic was cold and brutal. If Germany crushed the Soviet Union too quickly, desperate men in Moscow might reach for any weapon. If the Allies broke through too completely, the Nazi regime might unleash the gas stockpiles or experimental devices rather than face unconditional surrender. If Japan won at Midway and pushed toward India, the colonial powers might fracture the world into permanent war. The only hope, he believed, was to keep the war balanced on the edge, brutal enough that it would end, but never so one-sided that it provoked the ultimate weapons. By 1940, he had his first recruits. The officer sat across from him in a cafe in Bern, still in civilian clothes, technically on leave. He had served under von Manstein during the planning of Fall Gelb, the lightning strike through the Ardennes that would soon stun the world. The Swiss man did not offer him money. Instead, he asked a question. If France falls in 6 weeks, and Britain stands alone, and Germany turns east with nothing to stop it, what comes next? The officer thought for a long moment. Then we discover what happens when there are no more restraints. The Swiss man nodded. Unless someone, quietly, maintains them. The arrangement was simple. The officer would remain loyal to his command, to his general, to Germany, but he would also send through a secure Swiss intermediary selected intelligence, not enough to betray operations, but enough to give the Swiss man a picture of intentions and capabilities. In return, the officer would receive analysis, patterns the Swiss network observed, warnings of dangers his own side might not see. The goal was never to help the enemy win. It was to prevent the war from becoming something worse than war. By the time Guderian's panzers rolled into France in May 1940, the Swiss man had 3 such officers in the German command structure. When Rommel broke through at Sedan and raced toward the Channel, one of those officers ensured that certain fuel depots were reported as available when they were nearly empty, slowing the advance just enough that the British Expeditionary Force could reach Dunkirk. The evacuation was still chaotic, still bloody, but it happened, and when Hitler hesitated to launch the final assault that might have annihilated the trapped divisions, some historians would later wonder if faulty intelligence about British tank strength played a role. They would never know that the faulty intelligence had been carefully planted. On the Allied side, the network grew more slowly. British intelligence was fractured, suspicious, and the American military was still mobilizing, but the Swiss man was patient. In North Africa, as Rommel began his desert campaigns, a logistics officer in the British 8th Army found himself approached by an old acquaintance from a pre-war intelligence conference. The conversation turned to the problem of modern war. Not how to win, but how to win without triggering escalation. By late 1941, that officer was quietly feeding information to Switzerland and receiving back intelligence that helped British forces at Tobruk hold longer than German planners expected. The network's greatest coup came in the east. In December 1941, when Operation Barbarossa stalled before Moscow, a staff officer in Zhukov's command, a man who had survived Stalin's purges by being useful and invisible, was contacted through a trusted intermediary. The proposal was stark. The Soviet Union was losing millions of soldiers, and if the collapse became total, Stalin might use any weapon to survive. Could the officer help ensure that German intelligence overestimated Soviet strength just enough to make Wehrmacht commanders cautious, buying time for the Red Army to stabilize? The officer agreed, not out of disloyalty to the Soviet Union, but out of fear of what Stalin might do if cornered. By 1942, the Swiss man's network touched every major theater. He did not control the war, no single man could, but he influenced its edges, its tempo, its points of maximum danger. The work was exhausting and morally corrosive. Every decision meant deaths. Delay an offensive here, and soldiers die who might have been spared. Allow a breakthrough there, and a city burns. He kept lists in a locked drawer recording the calculations. If the German 6th Army is destroyed at Stalingrad, it demonstrates to Hitler that the war is unwinnable, potentially shortening the conflict. But if the encirclement is too perfect, too devastating, the regime might lash out with chemical weapons against Soviet cities, triggering a spiral toward mutual extermination. The key was Georgy Zhukov. The Soviet marshal was ruthless, brilliant, and uncompromising. The one commander Stalin trusted to turn around disasters. When Zhukov began planning Operation Uranus, the encirclement of Stalingrad, the Swiss man's contact in Soviet intelligence ensured that the timeline reached German ears, but through channels that made it seem like unconfirmed rumor, the kind that Wehrmacht command might dismiss. At the same time, a German officer in Army Group B reported fuel and ammunition stockpiles to Berlin as slightly higher than reality, creating a false sense that reserves could hold. The result was precisely calibrated. The Germans committed to Stalingrad with just enough force to be trapped, but not so much that their destruction triggered the doomsday escalation the Swiss man feared. Over 100,000 German soldiers marched into captivity. It was a catastrophe, but a contained one. The network paid its own price. In early 1943, the German officer who had helped orchestrate the Stalingrad intelligence died in a Soviet bombardment. The Swiss man never learned if it was random or if the NKVD had traced the leaks. Two other contacts vanished into Stalin's apparatus. One resurfaced after the war in a Siberian labor camp, and the Swiss man arranged for his quiet release through obscure diplomatic channels. The cost of maintaining the balance was measured in lives the network could not save, including its own. In the West, the network's most critical figure emerged in 1942, a staff officer in George S. Patton's command. Patton had taken command of the 2nd Armored Division and then I Armored Corps, and his G2, his chief intelligence officer, was a methodical, precise man named Oskar Koch. Koch was not part of the network. He was too loyal, too integral, and far too sharp to be manipulated. But his deputy, a major who handled liaison with British intelligence, was a perfect recruit. The major had served in the Great War, had seen gas attacks, and when the Swiss man's intermediary approached him in London, the pitch resonated. Patton will win battles. Your job is to make sure those victories don't trigger the next escalation. The major's role was subtle. He ensured that certain intelligence reached Koch and Patton at precisely the right time. Accurate intelligence, never fabricated, but selected and timed to shape decisions. When Patton prepared for the invasion of Sicily in 1943, the major made sure that reports of German reinforcements were slightly delayed, giving Patton the confidence to push aggressively. The island fell in weeks, but when Patton began planning for a direct thrust into Germany in 1944, the major ensured that intelligence about the strength of the Siegfried Line arrived early and detailed, tempering Patton's instinct to charge forward and potentially overextend into a trap that could destroy Third Army. On the German side, the network's deepest penetration was in the orbit of Erich von Manstein. Manstein was perhaps the Wehrmacht's most gifted operational planner, the architect of the Ardennes breakthrough, and the man who stabilized the Eastern Front after Stalingrad. In the summer of 1943, as Hitler prepared Operation Citadel, the massive assault on the Kursk salient, Manstein's staff included a signals officer who had been part of the Swiss network since 1940. The officer faced an impossible choice. If Citadel succeeded and crushed Soviet defenses, it might collapse Stalin's regime and potentially open the door to extreme measures. If it failed too completely, Germany might itself turn to forbidden weapons in desperation. The signals officer did not sabotage Citadel. Instead, he ensured that Soviet intelligence, through the Swiss man's network, received detailed information about the attack's timing and axis of advance. Zhukov used that intelligence to prepare a defense in depth that Manstein could not break. The battle became the largest tank engagement in history, a meat grinder that bled both sides but left the strategic picture intact. The Soviets held, but Germany was not shattered. The war would continue, grinding toward an end the Swiss man believed was inevitable, but without the sudden collapse that might trigger apocalypse. The signals officer was killed in an air raid 3 months later. Before he died, he sent a final message through the Swiss network. I do not know if we saved anything or only prolonged the suffering. In the Pacific, the network's reach was thinner but no less critical. Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, understood better than most Japanese leaders that the war with America was unwinnable in the long term. After the catastrophic defeat at Midway in mid-1942, where Japanese carrier power was shattered, Yamamoto became increasingly isolated. The Swiss man had one contact in the Imperial Japanese Navy, a staff officer who had studied in Europe before the war and who shared Yamamoto's doubts. The officer could do little to influence operations. Japanese command culture was too rigid, too enmeshed in notions of honor, but he could delay certain intelligence, ensure that some reports took longer to reach Tokyo. When American codebreakers located Yamamoto's flight path in April 1943 and prepared to ambush him, the Swiss man's Japanese contact learned of the intercept too late to warn anyone. Yamamoto died when American P-38s shot down his transport over Bougainville. The Swiss man noted the loss in his private journal. The one man in Tokyo who understood the stakes is gone. The war in the Pacific will now burn until there is nothing left to burn. He was not wrong, By 1945, the network in the Pacific had collapsed entirely, and the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, an outcome the Swiss man had spent 5 years trying to prevent. In Europe, the network's final and most desperate gamble came in December 1944. Oskar Koch, Patton's G2, had detected signs of a massive German buildup in the Ardennes. Most Allied intelligence officers dismissed the possibility. Germany was finished, everyone said. But Koch insisted, and Patton believed him. The major who served as Koch's deputy, the network's man inside Third Army, ensured that Koch's warnings reached Eisenhower's headquarters at Schaff through multiple channels, including informal contacts with Bedell, Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff. When the German offensive exploded into the Ardennes on December 16th, the Battle of the Bulge, the network had already positioned Patton to respond. Within days, Third Army pivoted north in one of the war's most remarkable maneuvers, relieving Bastogne and blunting the German spearhead. The Swiss man's calculation had been grimly precise. The offensive had to be large enough that Germany exhausted its last reserves, but not so successful that it split the Allied coalition or triggered panic decisions. The Bulge became the Wehrmacht's death blow and its grave. Over 100,000 German casualties, the Panzer reserves shattered, the road to Berlin open. By February 1945, the network was fragmenting. Soviet officers stopped responding. Stalin's paranoia was consuming everyone who had contact with the West. The German contacts were dead or unreachable, swallowed by the collapsing Reich. The Swiss man sat in his Zurich office as refugees poured across the borders and watched the map pins converge on Berlin. Zhukov and Eisenhower were racing each other now. The question was no longer how to prevent escalation, but whether the final collapse would come fast enough to stop the rumors he kept hearing. Whispers of Nazi experiments with nerve agents, of final vengeance plans, of Hitler's rages about weapons that could burn the world. In April, Berlin fell to Zhukov's armies. Hitler was dead. The surrender came in pieces, first in Italy, then in the West to Eisenhower's forces, finally in the East. The Swiss man burned the first set of documents on May 8, 1945, VE Day, in the same room where the war had been, a map covered with pins. Over the next 6 months, he systematically erased the network. Swiss bank accounts were closed, contact lists destroyed, intermediaries paid off or quietly disappeared into the post-war chaos. Of the 23 officers who had formed the core of the network, 11 were dead, 7 were in Soviet hands, and 5 had successfully returned to civilian life. None of them would ever speak of what they had done. In October 1945, Dwight Eisenhower met Georgy Zhukov in Berlin. The two men had developed a wary friendship, built on mutual respect and the shared experience of having commanded millions. During one conversation, Eisenhower mentioned the strange feeling he sometimes had during the war, that there was another layer of intelligence beneath the official reports, patterns that seemed too convenient to be random. Zhukov smiled and said, "In Russia, we have a saying, if you think you see a ghost, you are either drunk, mad, or the ghost wants you to see it." Eisenhower laughed. Neither man pursued the subject. By November, the Cold War had begun, and Zhukov was recalled to Moscow, his career about to be sabotaged by Stalin's jealousy. In 1946, at the Nuremberg trials, Manstein and Guderian sat in the dock. Prosecutors presented evidence of war crimes. The generals testified about orders and capabilities, about what they knew and when. In Switzerland, the man who had once coordinated a network touching all of them read the transcripts and noted what was not said. The curious gaps in intelligence, the moments when offensives had stalled for unclear reasons, the reports that had somehow reached the enemy at critical times. If any of the defendants suspected the network's existence, they never spoke of it. To do so would be to admit that the greatest generals of the age had been influenced, however slightly, by invisible forces. History does not forgive such admissions. The Swiss man lived another 30 years, a quiet banker in Zurich, wealthy but not famous, known only to a small circle of clients who valued discretion. He never wrote a memoir. When journalists occasionally interviewed him about Switzerland's wartime experience, he offered bland commentary about neutrality and international law. In private, he kept a single relic, the map from his wartime office folded carefully in a safety deposit box, the pin still marking Stalingrad and Kursk and Normandy and the bulge. Once, in the 1960s, while watching a television documentary about World War II, he saw footage of Patton and Montgomery and Rommel, and he quietly turned it off. He died in 1975, his ashes scattered in the Alps. The safety deposit box was opened by a lawyer and its contents destroyed per his instructions. No letters were found, no confession, no proof. The network had existed, if it existed, in a space that history could not reach. The gap between what generals ordered and what staff officers reported, the silence between decoded messages and filed intelligence, the invisible hand that might have nudged a world war a few degrees away from the abyss. Imagine for a moment a map room in Switzerland, in the middle of the worst war humanity had known. Imagine a man standing over that map, watching pins move as armies clashed across 3 continents. Imagine him asking himself every single day the question that had no answer. Does slowing the killing make you complicit in the deaths that still occur, or does it make you the only one who tried to keep the slaughter from becoming annihilation? History remembers Eisenhower and Zhukov, Patton and Rommel, Manstein and Montgomery and Guderian. It remembers their campaigns and their victories and their defeats. It does not remember the staff officers who carried the orders, the G2s who filtered the intelligence, the signals officers who relayed the messages. And it certainly does not remember the possibility, absurd, unverifiable, and perhaps entirely fictional, that someone, somewhere, tried to steer the entire war from the shadows, not toward victory but toward survival. If such a man existed, he died knowing he had failed to prevent the worst. The Holocaust continued. The atomic bombs fell, tens of millions perished. But he might also have believed in his final years that he had succeeded in preventing something worse. The use of nerve gas on European cities, the collapse of the Soviet Union into desperate annihilation warfare, the fracture of civilization into permanent conflict. He would have been wrong about some things and perhaps right about others. History will never tell him which. The Swiss ghost, if he lived at all, remains what ghosts must be, a story we tell to explain the patterns we cannot quite understand, the moments when the worst did not happen and we do not know why. In the gaps between what is recorded and what occurred, in the silence between the general's memoirs and the actual decisions, there is space for doubt, and in that doubt, the ghost endures, not as truth, but as possibility, a shadow intelligence behind the greatest conflict the world has known, forever anonymous and forever guilty, forever haunted and forever necessary. If you listen carefully to the old men who served as staff officers in that war, the ones still alive, the ones who remember, some will tell you they felt it, now and then, a sense that the orders they carried were part of a larger pattern they could not see, a hunch that the intelligence they analyzed had been shaped before it reached them, a whisper that someone, somewhere, was playing a longer game than any general could conceive. They will say it quickly, dismissively, as if embarrassed by the thought, and then they will change the subject. But they remember. And the map, folded in a safety deposit box that no longer exists, still marks the places where the world came closest to ending, and somehow, for reasons never quite explained, stepped back from the edge at the last possible moment. That is the story of the Swiss ghost.